"I'll give you $1 million if you can serve me in Arabic," the billionaire said, his voice smooth but sharp enough to cut through crystal and conversation. And just like that, the entire restaurant froze as if someone had pressed pause on a room full of power and pretense. Forks hovering midair, glasses suspended inches from lips. The low hum of jazz unraveling into silence under the weight of a single sentence that wasn't just a challenge but a performance, a spectacle designed for laughter. And across from him, standing with a polished tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, Naomi Brooks did not flinch, did not blink, did not offer the nervous smile the room expected from someone in her position. Because she had heard tones like that before, the kind that dressed disrespect in silk and called it humor, the kind that turned people into props for amusement. And tonight, in a private dining room perched 40 floors above downtown Manhattan, where deals worth billions were whispered over aged bourbon and imported steaks, Naomi had just become the centerpiece of someone else's entertainment. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, confidence draped over him like his tailored suit, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, his cufflinks catching the amber light as he gestured lazily toward her, repeating himself with a faint smirk as a few of his associates chuckled, already pulling out their phones, not because they cared about the outcome but because moments like this traveled fast online, humiliation packaged as humor, and Naomi could feel every lens tilt toward her without ever needing to look. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction, waiting for her to laugh it off, to apologize for something she hadn't done, to shrink just enough to make everyone else comfortable again. But Naomi Brooks had spent years mastering the art of stillness, the kind of stillness that didn't come from fear but from control, from knowing that silence, when held long enough, could shift the air in a room more than any rushed response ever could. She set the tray down gently on the edge of the table, the soft clink of porcelain echoing louder than it should have in the quiet, her movements precise, deliberate, as if she were stepping onto a stage she never asked for but fully understood, because long before she was balancing plates and memorizing orders, Naomi had been memorizing something else entirely, languages that carried history, culture, and power in every syllable. Languages she had once studied under fluorescent classroom lights before life demanded she trade textbooks for double shifts, and yet she never let that part of herself disappear. She carried it with her the same way she carried everything else, quietly, without announcement, without permission. And now, as Ethan's laughter softened into anticipation, as the room leaned in just a little closer, as if waiting for a punchline that hadn't landed yet, Naomi lifted her gaze for the first time that night and met his eyes directly, not with defiance, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, composure, the kind that doesn't ask for approval and doesn't bend under pressure. And in that brief moment, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath polished floors and designer shoes. Because for all his wealth, for all his control, Ethan Caldwell had just miscalculated the one variable he never bothered to measure, the person standing right in front of him. And as the silence stretched just a second too long, turning curiosity into tension, Naomi drew a slow breath, steady and unhurried, as if the noise of the room, the weight of the money, the arrogance wrapped in that $1 million offer, all of it existed somewhere far outside of her reach. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise to meet the moment. It anchored it, calm, clear, and unmistakably intentional, carrying the quiet promise that whatever came next was not going to follow the script anyone in that room thought they were watching. The words that left Naomi's mouth did not rush, did not stumble, did not search for approval. They flowed in Arabic with a clarity so precise it felt like the room itself had shifted languages without warning, smooth consonants and measured cadence filling the silence with something no one in that room had prepared for. And for a moment no one reacted because no one could, not immediately, not when the expectation had been so completely overturned that even comprehension lagged behind reality. Ethan Caldwell's smirk did not disappear right away, but it faltered, just slightly, the kind of subtle crack that only appears when confidence meets something it cannot immediately categorize. And Naomi did not stop there. She continued, her voice steady, translating not just a greeting or A simple phrase, but the exact words he had spoken moments earlier under his breath to one of his associates. The private remark he assumed no one else in the room could understand. A remark about leverage, about negotiating down partners who he believed relied too heavily on reputation over detail. And as her translation reached its final sentence, the air grew heavier, thicker, charged with a realization that spread across the table like a slow-moving ripple, because this was no longer a performance, this was exposure. And across from Ethan, seated in composed silence until now, was Khalid Rahman, the man whose investment firm held the deciding vote on a deal that had been in negotiation for months, a man who had said very little all evening, observing more than speaking, his presence understated but unmistakably significant. And for the first time that night, Khalid lifted his gaze fully, not toward Ethan, but toward Naomi, studying her with an expression that was not shock, but recognition, as if he had just witnessed something rare, something honest in a room built on controlled narratives. And Naomi turned slightly, acknowledging him not with a bow or hesitation, but with quiet respect. And then she spoke again, this time directly to him, in the same language, her tone shifting just enough to carry sincerity rather than demonstration, offering a brief clarification, a translation of intent rather than just words, ensuring that what had been said behind the polished confidence of a billionaire was now understood without distortion, without assumption, and the reaction was immediate in its stillness, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Ethan's hand, still holding his glass, lowered slowly to the table, the sound of crystal against wood sharper than before, because control, the one thing he had mastered in every room he entered, was slipping in a way he had never rehearsed. And around him, the subtle energy of the room shifted, the quiet alignment of power no longer leaning in his favor, but redistributing itself in silence. The associates who had laughed moments earlier now sat still, phones lowered, expressions recalibrating as they processed the implications of what had just unfolded, because this was not about a waitress answering a challenge. This was about a narrative collapsing in real time. And Naomi, who had been invisible for most of the evening, now stood at the center of a moment no one could ignore, her posture unchanged, her composure intact, as if none of this was surprising to her at all, as if she had simply allowed the truth to arrive when it was ready. And for Ethan, that was the most unsettling part. Not that she spoke the language, not that she understood the conversation, but that she had chosen exactly when to reveal it, not out of impulse, but precision. And in that precision was something far more powerful than any amount of money he could have offered, because for the first time that night, the room was no longer reacting to him. It was reacting to her. No one reached for their drinks anymore, not because they forgot, but because something far more important had replaced the rhythm of the evening, something that could not be swallowed or ignored. And at the center of it all stood Naomi Brooks, no longer just a figure moving between tables, but a presence that had quietly taken control of the room without asking for it, without demanding it, simply by revealing what had always been there beneath the surface. And Khalid Rahman leaned back, slightly in his chair, his fingers resting together in a calm, deliberate gesture, his expression thoughtful rather than reactive, as if he were not surprised by what he had just heard, but rather by how it had been delivered, by who had delivered it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was measured, composed, carrying a quiet authority that did not need volume to command attention. He addressed Naomi first, not Ethan, asking her a question in Arabic that was more layered than it sounded, not just testing her fluency, but her understanding, her interpretation, her ability to move beyond translation into meaning. And Naomi answered without hesitation, her tone steady, her words precise, not rushed, not performed, but grounded, as if she had been having this conversation long before anyone else realized it had begun. And the exchange between them unfolded. For several seconds, a dialogue that most of the room could not follow but could clearly feel, the cadence alone enough to signal that something real was taking place, something that did not belong to spectacle or entertainment, but to respect, to recognition. And as the final words settled into the air, Khalid gave a small nod, not exaggerated, not theatrical, but definitive, and then he turned his attention to Ethan. And that shift, that simple redirection of focus, carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, because for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell was no longer the one setting the tone. He was the one being evaluated within it, and the confidence that had once filled his posture now recalibrated into something more careful, more calculated, his mind moving quickly, searching for a way to recover, to reframe, to regain control of a situation that had slipped just far enough beyond his grasp to become dangerous, not in a loud or chaotic way, but in a quiet, undeniable one. And he offered a laugh, lighter this time, attempting to smooth over the moment, to reposition it as harmless, as a misunderstanding. But the room did not follow him. The laughter did not return, because the context had already shifted too far, the narrative already rewritten by someone he had not even considered part of the equation. And Naomi, still standing beside the table, did not interrupt, did not escalate. She simply remained, her composure unbroken, her presence steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interference, because she understood something that most people in that room did not, that once the truth is spoken clearly, it does not need to be repeated, it does not need to be defended. It simply exists, and people must decide what to do with it. And Ethan, for all his experience, for all his control in boardrooms and negotiations, now faced a decision that could not be managed with strategy alone, because this was not about numbers or leverage anymore. This was about perception, about trust, about the subtle but powerful shift that occurs when someone reveals not just what you say in public, but what you say when you think no one is listening. And Khaled's silence stretched just long enough to make that realization settle in fully before he spoke again. This time in English, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, acknowledging Naomi with a level of respect that contrasted sharply with how she had been treated just minutes before. And in that acknowledgement was something final, something that closed one version of the evening and opened another, because the balance of power had changed, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity. And in that clarity, the room no longer belonged to the man who had tried to control it. It belonged to the moment he could not control at all. The shift did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It arrived in the kind of silence that forces people to listen more carefully than they ever intended to. And when Khaled Rahman finally placed his glass down with quiet precision, the soft contact against the table sounded louder than anything that had been said so far. His eyes steady as they rested on Ethan Caldwell for a moment that stretched just long enough to remove any illusion of control. And when he spoke, his tone carried no anger, no accusation, only clarity, the kind that does not argue but concludes. He remarked that in business, language is not merely a tool for communication but a mirror of intention, and intention, once revealed, cannot be negotiated away. And that single sentence settled over the table like a verdict, not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that made every person in the room understand that something irreversible had just taken place. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair, adjusting his posture as if recalibrating could restore what had been lost, his mind working quickly through options, through responses, through the familiar strategies that had carried him through countless high-stakes meetings. But none of them fit this moment, because this was not a miscalculation in numbers, it was a misjudgment of character, and those are far more difficult to recover from. He attempted a response, his voice measured, offering clarification, framing his earlier words as strategy, as negotiation tactics, something impersonal, something standard. But even as he spoke, the weakness in the explanation was evident, not because it lacked logic, but because it lacked alignment with what had already been revealed. And across the table, the subtle reactions began to form, one associate shifting uncomfortably in his seat, another avoiding eye contact entirely, a third placing his phone face down as if distancing himself from a moment he had been eager to capture just minutes earlier. And Naomi, still standing, with quiet composure, observed none of it directly, yet seemed aware of all of it, her presence steady, her breathing even, as if she had stepped into a current and chosen not to resist it, because she understood that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about allowing truth to take its natural course. And Khaled, after a brief pause, turned his attention back to Naomi, acknowledging her again, this time in English, his words simple but deliberate, expressing appreciation, not just for her language but for her integrity, for for the way she had chosen to reveal meaning rather than simply display skill. And in that acknowledgement was a shift in hierarchy that no one could ignore, because respect had been reassigned in real time, not based on status or wealth, but on clarity and courage, and Ethan felt it, not as a dramatic loss, but as something quieter and more unsettling. The erosion of certainty, the realization that control, once assumed, is not guaranteed, and, for the first time that evening, he did not immediately respond, did not interrupt, did not redirect. He simply sat there, processing a moment that had unfolded beyond his design, and the room, once structured around his presence, now waited on something else entirely, something he could not manufacture or command. And as the tension settled into a new equilibrium, the weight of what had been exposed began to extend beyond the table itself, beyond the room, into the implications that would follow, because deals like this were not built on presentations alone. They were built on trust, on perception, on the unspoken understanding that what is said in confidence reflects what will be done in action, and that understanding had just been altered, not by confrontation, but by revelation. And Naomi, who had entered the evening as part of the background, now stood as the clearest voice in it, not because she had spoken the loudest, but because she had spoken at the exact moment when silence could no longer hide the truth. And in that moment, the balance of power did not explode or collapse. It simply shifted, quietly, decisively, into hands no one had thought to watch. The room did not return to normal, not the way people expect after tension passes, because this was not tension that could be brushed aside with a joke or softened with another round of drinks. This was the kind that lingered, that settled into the edges of every glance and every unspoken thought, and Ethan Caldwell could feel it in the way no one interrupted anymore. In the way conversations that once orbited around him had quietly collapsed into silence, replaced by something far less predictable, something he could not steer. And for a man who had built his entire career on controlling outcomes, that loss of direction was more disorienting than any confrontation could have been. He cleared his throat lightly, not to speak immediately but to reassert presence, to remind the room, and perhaps himself, that he still belonged at the center of it. Yet even that small gesture felt different now, heavier, as if the air itself no longer responded the way it used to. And across from him, Khalid Rahman remained composed, his posture unchanged, but his attention had shifted fully away from the deal and onto something more fundamental, something that could not be quantified on a spreadsheet or negotiated through projections. And when he finally spoke again, his words were calm, deliberate, and unmistakably decisive. He explained that partnerships are not built solely on opportunity, but on alignment, on the understanding that both sides operate with a shared respect for what is said and what is meant. And when that alignment fractures, even in small ways, the foundation becomes uncertain, and uncertainty, in his world, was not something to invest in. And that statement, delivered without hostility, carried the weight of a door quietly closing, not slammed, not forced, but shut with intention, and the implication was clear to everyone at the table. The deal that had been discussed for months, prepared through countless meetings and projections, was no longer moving forward in the way it had been expected to, not because of market conditions or financial risk, but because of a moment that revealed more than numbers ever could. And Ethan heard it, not just the words but the finality behind them, and for the first time that evening, his response did not come immediately, because there was no strategy left that could reshape what had already been seen. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without contest, because to argue would only deepen the fracture that had already formed. And around the table, the subtle shifts continued, one executive adjusting his jacket as if preparing to leave, another glancing at his watch with a new sense of urgency, the energy of the room no longer focused on negotiation but on conclusion. And Naomi Brooks, who had initiated none of this yet influenced all of it, stood quietly beside the table, her presence unchanged, not seeking recognition, not stepping forward to claim anything from the outcome, because she understood that what had happened did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the truth itself, and truth does not require ownership. It simply requires space to exist, and in that space, the balance of the evening had been rewritten entirely. Ethan finally reached for his glass again, but this time the motion was slower, more deliberate, as if even the smallest actions now carried weight, and when he set it back down, he looked toward Naomi. Not with the dismissive glance from earlier, but with something more measured, more aware, because he could no longer see her as background, as part of the setting. She had become part of the outcome, and that realization, quiet as it was, marked the true shift in the room, not the loss of a deal, not the silence of the table, but the recognition that power, when challenged by truth, does not always disappear, but it must change. And for Ethan Caldwell, that change had already begun, whether he was ready for it or not. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt structured, as if the entire room had collectively agreed to stop pretending and simply observe what remained after the illusion of control had been removed, and Ethan Caldwell sat in that silence with a stillness that no longer carried confidence, but calculation. The kind that comes after a system has already changed and one is left trying to understand what rules still apply. Yet even calculation failed to produce clarity in a moment, where perception itself had shifted, because nothing in his experience had prepared him for influence that did not respond to authority. And across from him Khalid Rahman remained composed, his hands resting naturally on the table, his posture unchanged, but his attention now resting on Naomi Brooks with a focus that had replaced negotiation entirely. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer than before, not in weakness, but in finality, explaining that decisions in his world were not only about performance, but about trust. And trust, once questioned, does not return through explanation. It returns through consistency over time, or it does not return at all. And as those words settled, the remaining ambiguity in the room dissolved, because everyone understood what had just been communicated without it needing to be stated directly. The partnership that had been the reason for this entire evening was no longer moving forward in its intended form, not because of disagreement over terms, but because of a misalignment that could not be corrected within the time frame of opportunity. And Ethan finally exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that attempts to hold composure in place even as circumstances shift beneath it. And for a brief moment, he looked around the table as if trying to find something familiar in the expressions of his associates. But what he found instead was distance, subtle and immediate, the kind that appears when people begin to separate themselves from outcomes they no longer wish to be associated with. And Naomi, still standing quietly near the edge of the table, did not move to engage or interpret the moment further, because she understood that what had already been revealed did not require reinforcement. It only required acceptance. And Khalid finally stood, not abruptly, but with the calm efficiency of someone concluding a meeting that had reached its natural end, adjusting his jacket as he spoke a final acknowledgement to Ethan, polite but unmistakably conclusive. And then he turned slightly toward Naomi, offering a brief nod that carried more weight than any extended praise could have, because it recognized not just what she had done, but what she represented in that moment. Clarity in a space built on assumption. And as Khalid prepared to leave, the remaining executives followed his movement instinctively, gathering their belongings with quiet urgency, the energy of the room dissolving not into chaos, but into resolution. And Ethan remained seated for a few seconds longer than necessary, watching the room empty in a controlled flow, as if trying to identify the exact point at which the evening had stopped belonging to him. And when he finally stood, he did so without spectacle, without resistance, acknowledging in silence what could no longer be redirected. And as he passed Naomi on his way out, there was no exchange of words, only a brief pause in his step, a recognition that neither apology nor explanation would carry weight in a moment already defined by outcome. And then he continued forward, leaving behind a room that no longer reflected the hierarchy in which he had entered it. Because what had changed that night was not simply a deal, but the assumption of who holds influence when the conversation is stripped down to truth. And in that absence of illusion, Naomi remained exactly as she had been throughout, steady, unclaimed by the outcome, but undeniably central to how it had unfolded. The elevator doors closed behind Ethan Caldwell without sound, sealing him out of the floor that had once felt like his domain. And as the numbers descended, he stood alone inside a polished metal reflection that no longer returned the image he was used to seeing, because something subtle had shifted in the way he perceived himself. not as a man who had lost control, but as a man who had misread the environment entirely. And outside the building, the night air of Manhattan felt colder than before, sharper against his thoughts as he stepped onto the sidewalk where black cars waited in quiet formation. But he did not immediately enter one. Instead, pausing for a moment, as if recalibrating the distance between intention and outcome, while inside the restaurant above, the remaining staff moved cautiously through the aftermath of the evening, resetting tables, lowering lights, and trying to return the space to something resembling normalcy, though nothing about it felt normal anymore. Because stories like this do not simply end, they echo, and Naomi Brooks stood near the service corridor for a brief moment longer, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady, not carrying triumph, not carrying relief, but something quieter, something grounded, as if she had simply completed a conversation the world had been delaying for far too long. And when one of the senior managers approached her cautiously, offering words that were careful, overly polite, and slightly uncertain, she responded with equal calm, acknowledging nothing more than what had actually occurred, not exaggerating it, not diminishing it, simply placing it back into reality where it belonged. And then she removed her apron in a single smooth motion, folding it with the same precision she had carried throughout the entire evening, before placing it on the counter without ceremony. And as she stepped away from the kitchen lights into the quieter hallway, her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. A missed message from earlier in the night now visible, but she did not open it immediately, because for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a moment of stillness that was entirely her own, not defined by the expectations of others. And above her, the city continued its usual rhythm of late-night movement, taxis passing through intersections, distant sirens fading into background noise, office towers glowing with unfinished work, but none of it felt connected to what had just unfolded inside the restaurant. Because events like this do not remain contained within their location, they extend through perception, through conversation, through the quiet reshaping of assumptions that people carry long after they leave the room. And Ethan, now seated in the back of his vehicle as it moved through Manhattan traffic, stared out at the passing lights without speaking, replaying not the confrontation itself, but the silence that followed it, the moment when control stopped responding to him. And in that silence, he recognized something uncomfortable, not defeat in the traditional sense, but exposure, the realization that authority without understanding is temporary at best. And as the vehicle merged onto a wider avenue, he finally lowered his gaze, resting back into the seat without resolution. While inside the restaurant, Naomi stepped out into the night air, the doors closing gently behind her, and she paused on the sidewalk for only a second, looking down the street as the city continued forward around her. And then she walked, not quickly, not slowly, but with the same steady pace she had carried throughout the entire evening, leaving behind a space that would remember her not as an interruption, but as the moment it stopped being possible to ignore what had always been there. By the time midnight settled fully over Manhattan, the story had already begun its second life, not inside the restaurant, not inside the boardroom, but inside the quiet digital currents of the city where information moves faster than explanation. And on screens held in apartments, taxis, and late-night offices, fragments of what had happened began to circulate. Short clips, partial descriptions, rewritten interpretations, each one attempting to compress a complex moment into something easily understood. And yet none of them fully captured the stillness that had defined that evening. Because stillness does not translate easily into headlines, but it carries weight far beyond them. And Ethan Caldwell saw one of those clips before he reached his penthouse, his assistant hesitating before showing it to him. But he watched anyway, expression unchanged, though something behind his eyes tightened as he observed not the words, not the reactions, but the absence of reaction at the exact moment he had expected control to return. And when the video ended, he did not speak, only closed the device and placed it on the seat beside him as the car continued upward through the city streets. While elsewhere, Naomi Brooks had already returned to her small apartment in Brooklyn, the kind of space defined not by size, but by consistency, where the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic outside created a rhythm more familiar than anything she had experienced earlier that night. And she stood for a moment near the doorway before removing her shoes, placing them neatly as she always did. Then walking to the sink to pour a glass of water she did not immediately drink, because her mind was not occupied with triumph or reflection, but with simplicity, with the fact that she had spoken clearly when it mattered, and that clarity had been enough, and that realization, quiet as it was, carried more weight than any external validation could provide. And in the hours that followed, the city continued its expansion of interpretation, conversations forming in places she would never hear, offices discussing implications, investors reassessing tone, professionals debating perception versus intent, because what had occurred inside that restaurant had moved beyond individual interaction and entered the space of narrative, where meaning is constantly reshaped by distance. And yet in her apartment, none of that reached her directly, only the echo of a phone that occasionally lit up and then dimmed again, while she sat by the window watching the distant movement of headlights along the street below, and Ethan, now alone in the quiet of his residence overlooking Central Park, stood without moving for several minutes, not looking at any screen, not responding to any message, because for the first time in a long while, there was nothing immediate to correct or redirect, only the awareness that something fundamental had been revealed in a space he had previously believed was fully under his understanding, and that awareness did not resolve into anger or denial, but into something more complex, a pause that extended beyond the evening itself, into the structure of how he would now interpret every room he entered, while Naomi, across the city, finally drank the water she had been holding, then placed the glass down gently, and turned off the light beside her bed, allowing the silence of her apartment to return fully, unchanged, steady, and complete, as the city outside continued its endless motion, carrying forward the afterimage of an evening that no longer belonged to the moment it happened, but to everything that would follow it. Morning arrived in Manhattan without ceremony, as it always did, lights slowly spreading between buildings like an unspoken continuation of everything that had happened the night before. And in that quiet transition from darkness to day, the city carried on as if nothing had changed. Yet for those who had been present, something irreversible had already taken root, not in headlines or formal statements, but in perception itself. And Ethan Caldwell stood by the window of his apartment, coffee untouched on the table behind him, watching the first movement of traffic below, as if searching for a version of the world that still aligned with his expectations. But the alignment was no longer there, not in the same way, because what had once been automatic now required interpretation, and interpretation always introduces uncertainty. While across the river in Brooklyn, Naomi Brooks prepared for her day in silence. The same routine she had followed countless times before, but now each motion carried a different weight, not because her circumstances had changed externally, but because she had seen how quickly perception could shift when truth was no longer filtered through hierarchy. And when she stepped outside her apartment building, the air felt ordinary, cool, steady, unchanged, and that contrast between internal awareness and external normalcy created a quiet clarity that stayed with her as she walked toward the subway. While in another part of the city, conversations that had begun the night before continued to unfold in conference rooms and private offices, where people replayed fragments of what they had seen, not always accurately, but persistently, because moments that disrupt expectation tend to multiply in interpretation rather than diminish. And Ethan, now seated at a long table in a closed morning meeting, listened as his advisors spoke in carefully measured tones about reputation, alignment, and repositioning. Yet he heard something different beneath their language, a subtle recalibration of distance, not rejection, but reassessment. And for the first time, he did not interrupt, did not correct, did not redirect, because he understood that control in this context was no longer about speaking first, but about understanding what had already been said without words. And Naomi, arriving at the restaurant later that day for her next shift, entered through the service corridor as she always had. Yet the atmosphere greeted her differently, not with celebration or attention, but with a kind of quiet awareness, the kind that exists when people recognize a boundary has shifted even if they cannot define how. And she acknowledged her colleagues with the same calm professionalism as before, moving through preparation tasks, organizing tables, checking inventory, each action grounded in routine, because routine, is often the only structure that remains unchanged when perception around it evolves. And later that afternoon, a manager approached her not with urgency, but with caution, offering a brief acknowledgement of the previous night, careful not to overstate or understate its significance. And Naomi listened without interruption, then responded simply, not framing herself as central to anything, but as someone who had done what was necessary in the moment it was required. And as the day continued, neither her life nor Ethan's returned to what it had been before, because there are moments that do not conclude when the conversation ends or when people leave the room. They continue to operate quietly beneath the surface of everything that follows, reshaping assumptions in ways that are not immediately visible, but become undeniable over time. And by evening, as Manhattan lights began to reflect once again across glass and steel, both of them moved through their separate worlds carrying the same unspoken awareness that what had changed was not the event itself, but the understanding of how quickly power shifts when it is no longer protected by assumption. And in that understanding, nothing about their external lives needed to be altered for everything internally to already be different.